Have you ever wondered how certain fantastical tales of folklore and fairy tales came to be true? While many of us chalk that up to fertile imaginations of our ancestors or perhaps being under the influence of hallucinogens, Michael Mott is saying these tales may well be based on reality. In his book, Caverns, Cauldrons, and Concealed Creatures, Michael tells us that there are vast underground biosystems that are home to species that humanity has come to fear, specifically humanoid species that are not of Earth. Welcome. Right. Wow, what an intriguing book this is.
Well, I appreciate that. I don't know if I would say they're not of Earth. I think that actually they very much are of Earth.
You're right. I just had this conversation with another gentleman because we tend to think of them as otherworldly, but in fact they're just a different species here.
Well, I think that what we're seeing here is a group of species, and they are to some extent related to human beings. Now, this is told in every folklore tradition around the world.
We're going to get into a whole bunch of them because there are so many in different ways these beings show up, from seemingly benign and cute and friendly to terrifying. But first of all, I want to go to you because you had an event in your young life in Morocco that wasn't very, well, it was terrifying to you as a young boy because you had a housekeeper that kept. And the people in Morocco are very much ordered toward the unseen worlds and the jinn and fear of them.
Well, they did fear the jinn. I remember an incident when my brother and I actually had being just kids, we had brought home a large lizard, and they just lost it. They could not handle this thing. They said it was a jinn and so forth. And of course, we just laughed, and it was just a lizard. But there was another incident when we were on a river on a tour, and the boatman took us around a bend, and there was a cave up in the cliff side. And so I asked him, being 7 or 8 years old, I said, what's in that cave? And he said, he says, you don't want to go in there. And I said, why? And he said, because Aja Khadija lives in there, and that she is a witch, and she is from the underworld, and all this kind of stuff, and she's really bad, and she'll come get you. She takes little kids, and this is a typical boogeyman type story. But when I got older and I was doing more research into these things, I remembered this story, and over and over again we hear this idea.
But it scared you.
Well, it had an effect. It definitely piqued my imagination.
There seems to be a feeling in general that what is subterranean is dark and evil. I mean, going back into mythology and the journey into the underworlds and such, and dealing with demons before one can surface back into the sun, the light.
Well, even going back to the oldest written story we have, Gilgamesh, he had to journey into the underworld, and he was searching for immortality. Well, the reason he was searching for immortality was because he was descended from someone that claimed to be a god. And this is a theme that you find again and again, demigods, or as the Torah and the Old Testament called them, Nephilim, or Anakim, which is very similar to Anuna, you'll notice. These are beings that are part human, and they're part of this underworld reality. And just like with today, with so-called alien abductions and things of this nature, they're fascinated by human genetic diversity, and they seem to require an influx of human genetic material. If they were from the other side of the galaxy or another star system, and they could travel at the speed of light or warp space and time or create a wormhole, their technology would be so advanced, and I'm not saying that it's not, but they would be able to recombine their own DNA, rewrite their DNA, repair any damage. They wouldn't need to come all the way out here to do it.
That is true.
In other words, the only reason they would do this is because in some way they are genetically related to us. And when you look
or have to at least adapt to this environment.
Yes, exactly. Maybe they're half genetically related to us. If you look at the biodiversity of the earth, you have hermit crabs and
people are not asking the right questions. They're not asking the right questions because they kind of think they already know the answers.
Blue whales and elephants and Maasai warriors and penguins. And if you were from another world or just someplace you're totally isolated, if you'd lived on an island your whole life and didn't know anything about the rest of the world, and you saw all these different life forms, you would think, where in the world did all these things come from? They can't possibly come from the same place, but they do. they share a common genetic heritage. They are actually genetically similar and related, from the biodiversity of the earth. Well, when you look at the things that people encounter, whether it's, so-called aliens of different types, or hairy humanoids, or chupacabras, or any number of strange creatures that people say that they've encountered, there's shock and there's awe when they see these beings, but they're astonished. They're not thinking in terms of, does this conform to an earthly vertebrate template? And without fail, it does. They always conform to an earthly vertebrate template. They have bilateral symmetry, which means both sides are basically equal, 2 arms, 2 legs, or 4 flippers, or whatever the case may be. And they are going to be either reptilian, mammalian, or a combination of the two. Now, people that claim they've seen insectoids, well,
the ant people.
Right, but insects are part of the Earth's genetic diversity.
Yes, they are.
And on top of that, these insectoids that people see generally have 2 arms and 2 legs.
And the praying mantis people?
Yes, still 2 arms and 2 legs.
2 arms and 2 legs,
So
yes.
we're talking about a vertebrate of some kind, or at least something that's partially vertebrate. Now, is it some sort of genetically engineered form? Who knows? I mean, ancient texts are full of stuff like that. You'll find legends all over the world about the gods mixing species together. In the book of Enoch,
Yeah.
one of the apocryphal books, that's one of the great sins before the flood of the Nephilim, the ones who were already half human. And one of the things that they did, because they weren't just physical giants, they were mental giants. And they were, the books of Enoch, all 3 versions say that they were mixing human and animal DNA. And that this was a great threat to the future propagation of those species as they were meant to be. In other words, it threatened their viability if it were to continue. And so you have this in several of the apocryphal books. Well, the Old Testament just simplifies it and says all flesh had corrupted its way upon the earth. But it's talking about what was talked about in the book of Enoch, which was this gene splicing and creating these creatures. Well, when you look today at the things that people see, like El Chupacabras and a number of other anomalous creatures, they exhibit the same sort of hybrid characteristics of several species mixed into one. And we're not talking about supernatural stuff here. I think we're talking about, in this particular instance, probably talking about science.
You call them interterrestrials.
Yeah,
That's one term you use
right.
in your book, instead of extraterrestrials, interterrestrials.
And subterrestrials.
And subterrestrials. And,
Right.
now I don't even know if this is related. It's just popping into my mind. It's a conversation I had with a fellow who'd been with an intelligence community. He died a rapid and unfortunate death, but
Right.
just before he died, I had this conversation with him about what was happening to the human species. And he was saying that there's going to be a larger percentage or incorporation of copper in the blood as opposed to iron in the blood. And he was talking about species that already possess high levels of copper, and he seemed to be referring to what we have called ETs, or pale or blue or gray types of species, as having more copper in the blood.
That's interesting. I know that if you have too much silver in your blood, that you will take on that sort of a cast. But the thing is that, again, we have to wonder what we hear. How much is disinformation, and how much is when I hear the word alien, I think anything strange to you is
alien. Exactly.
Right.
Well, he was dealing in some pretty strange projects.
Right.
It was a private conversation.
And I'm not saying, again, that there are not extraterrestrials out there in the universe. I believe the universe is teeming with life. I believe it's everywhere. And some of them are probably advanced, and they're probably, bipedal, humanoid forms. But logic dictates that the huge variety of bipedal, basically reptilian, mammalian appearing creatures that have been seen by people here on Earth are not all coming here from 50 different planets.
Right.
They're
Right.
from here, and they've always been from here.
Okay, so let's start getting into more the geological aspect of the story, and explain to us what the moho is, and let's explain about different attempts to drill down
Right.
deep into the Earth's crust for certain discoveries, and let's talk about this part of it.
Scientists discovered some people have a secret pooping habit that keeps them effortlessly thin.
Well, we've discovered through seismology that there is an anomalous region at the crust mantle boundary, the Moho-Rovesik, which is shortened to Moho. And we know that it's anomalous because when we bounce seismic waves through it, it shows valleys, troughs, peaks and troughs, and basically what looks like areas of less density. Now, some of those areas may be filled with water, air, magma, all three in different areas. But this is a worldwide structure, 20 miles down and beneath the continent and 11 miles
Under the sea.
Under the sea. And there's always going to be somebody wondering if there's a military application to it. The U.S. Navy tried to drill to it and failed. They got almost there and they quit. The Russians tried to drill to it and they quit, supposedly. But it's an area of immense pressure, and the interesting thing is that all over the world there are large cavern systems that constantly blow air. There are huge volumes of air that constantly pour out of these caves, like Blowing Cave in Arkansas, Lechuguilla in New Mexico, but some of the big caves in Vietnam and other places. There are always huge, vast amounts of air pouring out of these caverns. Well, where's the air coming from? That air has to come from somewhere. So, my general feeling is it's probably coming from the Moho. I'm not sure how it's being produced. Maybe it's being produced by heat in reaction with subterranean water. But somehow it's coming about and it's pouring out. Now, where you have huge amounts of air moving and oxygen, you're going to, and water, you're going to have life. And where you have bacteria, you're going to have other forms of life because there's always stuff that feeds off of bacteria. And now it's been postulated that as many as 90% of all the bacteria on Earth may be subterranean. Well, they find new subterranean bacteria every year, and they also find other life forms every year in caves and caverns.
And just the network of fungus alone.
Oh, yeah. And so, we're talking about, we barely know anything about the surface of our planet, much less what's under the surface. We find new discoveries all the time here on the surface. And then we go into the oceans, the depths of the oceans where a lot of UFOs come from.
Yes, the USOs.
Yeah, and the Earth itself, we can only go down so far because the pressure gets to be so great. And again, the whole idea of the elevated pressure adapting to greater pressure seems to tie in with a lot of these anomalous life forms. They seem to exhibit the characteristics of something that originates in a realm of higher density or higher pressure.
What about the anomalies of the poles?
The anomalies of the poles. Well, I do talk about that in my book. I have a chapter on that, and that there is an indication that there is something anomalous about the poles. There are some things that just don't add up in terms of mysteries of weather and encounters that people have had and UFO activity over the poles and things of this nature. Now, does this mean that the Earth is a geode? Or does it just mean that there's entrances there to these subterranean areas? Or could it be that there's some sort of wormhole type thing going on that ties into the gravitational field of the Earth? We really don't know. Whoever knows is probably not going to tell us.
Well, and then there was supposedly, during the Hitler years, a lot of interest in Antarctica.
Right.
And supposedly a base that was established in Antarctica.
Right.
He was fascinated with Antarctica and whatever life forms were there.
Well, yeah, that's a rumor, but it's a very good rumor.
It's a good rumor.
It is because, just recently they discovered that the body found, in the bunker was not Hitler.
Right.
It was a female by DNA analysis. So everybody said, well, Hitler died in the bunker. Well, no, he didn't, apparently. Now, will they rewrite the history books? I doubt it.
Probably not going to be written, but nonetheless, there have been some very interesting
Yes.
bits of evidence having to do with certain missing submarines that went off the radar, and
some were never found. Now a few were found off the coast of Argentina,
right,
and they were the people on board were captured, but more were not found, and
right.
They were the ones that were supposedly sent to Antarctica.
Right.
Now, there were German officials who made some statements to the effect that they were working on a base there,
yes,
and that they had discovered something fantastic. They had discovered a subterranean realm, basically,
yes.
that where everything was totally different than it is here on the surface. And allegedly, Admiral Byrd
yes.
went down there and came back so shaken
Yes.
that he said we have to nuke it till it glows. If we don't, we're going to be overwhelmed. There's a superior technology there. And he was taken aside and said, we're not going to talk about that. And he kind of backed off the statement. Now, there are people now who say, well, that didn't happen. Well, that's always the case. But, for decades and decades, people remembered hearing this and seeing this. And there are people that still remember seeing the newsreel that he sent back where he flew beyond the poles.
Right.
And saw something strange in terms of a landscape that should not have been there. So again, what are we talking about? Are we talking about, is the Earth a geode? Well, it doesn't tie in well with the ideas of how gravity works and how our electromagnetic field is
Yes,
formed.
but the new information on gravity, which is something I was told by some beings quite a long time ago, is that gravity is not what we thought it is. It isn't a
Right.
one-way force, it's a two-way force that creates places of equilibrium within gravity moving both directions.
And it warps space and time around itself.
Yes.
So if we're talking about something that is warping space and time, you might be able to create what's known as a space-time bubble. Could that be what the hollow Earth actually is? Could it be a space-time bubble? In other words, the Earth is built like we think it is, and it generates the electromagnetic field. But could there be some other way to access a space-time bubble that is also created by the gravitational field of the Earth? I mean, these are all just ideas, but they seem to be valid, at least to consider and talk about.
Yes. Okay. So we have even in cave art extraterrestrial presence. What appears to be extraterrestrials. That's what
Right.
we've labeled them as thus
Right.
far.
Right.
And I had a conversation with a man named Ken Cherry, who's written a book more with the military and intelligence community implications of
Right.
having these underground ET species that are actually, native.
Yeah.
And so let's talk about that from your point of view.
Well, I think that there is evidence that there's somebody else here with us, and they've always been here. You talk about cave art, that's why I say, people think that all these mysteries are new, UFOs coming from, Alpha Centauri. Well, no, they've been here ever since people could record them being here.
Aboriginals, the one Gina.
Right. Even in some of the caverns in France, there's pictures which look like flying saucers. I don't know what else the caveman could have been attempting to convey, since there were no animals running around that looked like that. So, there are a lot of indications that we've never been alone. Now, my concern here with these types of things is
These are the humanoid species we're speaking of, yeah.
right. I think we're talking about more than one species. I think there are species that are indigenous that are kind of indifferent to us, and by that I mean they've probably advanced so far by now that the only thing they see us as is a nuisance, maybe. And the reason I say that is because if, for instance, there were a reptilian species which basically evolved to almost look totally human, over time they would. Or if there were other species that had been here that had evolved to a higher state of technological advancement, they could have had their singularity a long time ago. In other words, if they discovered a way to use, say, the computing power of gigantic crystalline structures inside the Earth.
Which was said to exist in Atlantean times, for example.
Right, and now we know that quartz, which is, crystals are made of even limestone, quartz, magnetite, silica, and all these things, they will hold energy and they can transmit energy. They store energy and information.
Right.
Exactly. So let's say that someone figured this out 500,000 years ago. How advanced would they be now? Let's say you take just one cavern like the cave in Mexico that's full of crystals, and you turn it into a supercomputer. What capabilities would you open up for yourself? They would essentially be like gods, as far as we're concerned. So I think we have groups like that. I think they're out there. I also think that there are other groups that are a little more predatory and parasitic towards humanity in the way they look at us. I think they're the ones that are probably related to us in some way, in terms of being a hominid or partially a hominid. The ones we were talking about earlier. I think that they see...
Are you speaking more of the Greys and that type of being, or a reptilian? Or...
I'm talking about beings that want to use us for genetic purposes, to take what is not theirs without permission. Let's just call it what it is. That's what they do.
Oh, wait a minute. If they've always been here,
right.
What is to say? You say to take what's not theirs. Look what we do in terms of
I
genetic
agree.
experimentation on other species.
But see, looking from a human perspective, I have to say that, before somebody comes and steals my genetics, I would like to give them permission first.
That would be nice. I'm
Yeah.
sure the species we experiment
Oh,
on would
I'm
love
sure.
to have been granted permission. I mean, would love to have asked permission too if they could speak.
And
I'm just playing devil's
Oh,
advocate for
sure,
just one moment.
sure.
This is a complex
Oh, it's
subject.
super
and
complex.
anyone that we understand is in the right?
Well,
but if we
well,
don't understand, they're in the wrong.
I look at it like this. I look at what happens with humans when we tag animals.
Yeah.
Okay, a biologist will go in the field and they will tranquilize an animal where it's totally out of it and it's not feeling the pain, and it will tag the animal and examine it. Then it will set the animal free and make sure it's basically back on its way. This is called being humane, because we humans came up with this.
We
But then-
did, except that until you go to university labs, that's not
true.
humane.
That's true. But when I look at some of the stories that people tell about their encounters with these beings that show up, and basically, okay, they're supposed.
Tell us about the encounters, but we also have to
Right.
say at least they lived to tell the story.
That's
okay.
right. That's right. But these beings are supposedly advanced, genetically, mentally, technologically advanced, and they will put some sort of a dampening field out, which seems to inhibit the electromagnetic activity of the brain of the subject. That's what they're doing, I think.
Right. Kind of stunning the
Yeah,
person.
and basically they put them in a state of an altered state of consciousness
Yeah.
where they cannot fight, they cannot defend themselves, kind of like we do with animals in the field.
Well, oftentimes people are paralyzed, conscious yet paralyzed.
But they're still conscious.
Right.
Now, here's the thing that always got me about the whole situation. Often they will go out of their way to make sure that the person knows what's going on, and they will do painful procedures without any anesthetic, not even a local anesthetic, and say, basically, the message is, look what we can do. Look what we can do to you, and there's nothing you can do about it. Now, this, to me, is sadistic. We can call it what you want, but to me, it seems to be a control mechanism. It's sort of like conditioning, Pavlovian conditioning, or other types of conditioning where, you'll get used to this. This is what we do. We have the right to do this. We'll
Or they're
make
just
sure.
incredibly insensitive.
Insensitive. And if they're supposedly telepathic, then they know what they're doing. They know the terror that's there.
Maybe their emotional bodies aren't developed like ours.
Well, they've been around a long time. I kind of think it's more along the lines of they're interested in how we react. And if it's cruel, it's cruel. When you look back in the folklore, you'll see that this is not dissimilar to some of the things that shaman go through when they encounter non-human entities. Their bodies are dismembered and then put back together. They feel it all. They can't stop it. Or the demonology of the Middle Ages had similar things that happened. The people who practice alchemy, the first scientists, the alchemists, they claimed that some things like this would happen sometimes with some of the elementals that they had to deal with. So we're looking at something here, which to me, these are all masks for the same thing, the same phenomenon. So I think that there's a disconnect here, and I have to say that any species that is just inherently cruel, we need to be really cautious of how we deal with them. And I find the same thing.
I would agree. Whether
Yeah.
they're intentionally cruel or whether they just don't have any sensitive mechanisms going either
Right.
way, that's something we wouldn't be comfortable interfacing with.
Right, because they appear to have, at best, indifference, and sometimes they exhibit contempt. There have been, plenty of stories of them being sort of contemptuous of human beings. So I think that, again, that there are those who genetically need what we have. They have to have a regular influx of this because I don't know if they've hit a genetic bottleneck or if they're a hybrid species which is related to us, but for whatever reason they have to have a semi-regular influx of human genetic material.
Do you think maybe they want to ultimately emerge
Become
and
more like
become
us?
a species that lives above the crust of the earth?
I think that there's a certain amount of jealousy here, honestly, for some things that have been
it
said.
seems if I could choose,
Yeah,
I'd sure
yeah,
rather
yeah.
live
And-
above the ground.
Exactly. And so they kind of resent us for the fact that they are dependent on us. And again, this is in the literature. You can see this in you read Carla Turner's stuff or Betty Andreasen. These beings are very manipulative and deceptive, and they do need what we have, and they kind of seem to resent the fact that they need it. one of the things that we should look at too is the fact that even though we know now that these things have been going on for probably tens of thousands of years at the very least, that these beings still do not want us to know where they really come from.
Mm-hmm.
For instance, when they were portraying themselves as gods, they would come down and Zeus would come and chase the daughters of men, and then he would say, well, you can't really do anything about it because I live up there on that big mountain and you can't get that high, and so you're just out of luck. Okay? Well, we reached a point where we could reach the top of the mountains. We can, go down a certain depth into the sea.
Not far enough, though.
No, they're still there. but now whenever they encounter people, they go overboard, as far as I can tell, to say, well, we come from up there. You see that star up there? That's where we come from. Oh, in other words, don't look over here under this mountain. Don't look over beneath that desert, under that ocean. So you saw UFOs coming out of the Great Lakes. Well, don't look in there. Forget about that. That's not where we come from. And just because they have the ability to zip around the solar system doesn't mean that they're not from here.
And that's an interesting point. Let's talk about, you talked about a sea a moment ago.
Yeah.
I meant to ask you this a little bit ago. Princeton seismologists claim there's this gigantic sea 555 miles under modern-day Europe. Did I read that correctly?
Yes, there are indications that there are both bodies of water and there's huge amounts of water. There are huge amounts of water which are locked in the strata. And that means that they are actually basically almost in molecular form in the strata. But there are other areas which do seem to be full of liquid water. And they're finding new ones all the time.
And they said another one here, 2,000 miles under Indonesia.
Right. There's
2,000 miles under Indonesia.
Yes. Now, I would imagine that water's probably superheated. And if it is,
You'd have a tropical environment
or you have an engine
Mm-hmm.
for the development of life in higher levels in the crust. In other words, if you're generating that kind of heat, say super thermal heat at that
Mm-hmm.
depth, then that water is going to produce oxygen. It's going to produce water vapor. It's going to percolate up through the crust. And the Earth is not a solid object. People have this concept about the Earth being solid. The Earth is full of fissures, cracks, chasms, gaps, cave systems. All these things are there. So you have the possibility, under the right conditions, in any number of places where different forms of life could develop at high pressure.
Right.
Yeah, and again, you see this with a lot of the creatures that are seen by people. There are many anomalous encounters with people who encounter creatures where they hit them with a shovel, and they say it's just like hitting a brick wall.
That was kind of odd when I read that.
Yeah, or they shoot them, and the creature's just irritated. I mean, it hurts.
Right.
It seems to sting.
Right.
But it
Doesn't take them down.
doesn't take them down. Or with the so-called men in black, who, interestingly enough, they claim to come from at least in one encounter, they said they came from the nation of the third eye, which is interesting because according to Tibetan Buddhism, the king of the world is the head of the nation of the third eye.
We're out of time. What an intriguing conversation, and hopefully people will be able to still sleep well tonight
Thank
after
you.
this one, because the reality is it's always been there.
It always has
We've
been.
always been living side by side. The reality is what you look at day in and day out around you in your life, that's your life.
We just have to wake up
That's
to what's
their
really
life.
going on.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, thank you so much, Michael.
Thank you. I enjoyed it.
Again, Michael's intriguing book is titled Caverns, Cauldrons, and Concealed Creatures, which you can find through major booksellers. You can also learn a lot more about his work by visiting his website at gravedistractions.com. Until next time, thank you for joining us here on